In mid-June, the man who once promised to march nuclear missiles to Ukraine's doorstep stood before cameras and apologized. Alexander Lukashenko, Putin's most loyal ally, the leader who spent 3 years hurling the harshest rhetoric in the war at Kyiv, publicly expressed regret to Volodymyr Zelensky. And then he said something no one expected. Belarus would not, under any circumstances, enter the war against Ukraine as a military force. The world saw an apology, but an apology is never just an apology. When a leader who spent years projecting strength suddenly chooses humility, the real question isn't what he said, it's what he saw that made him say it. Because something forced this. Something turned the most defiant voice on the front into the most cautious one. And the answer to that question reveals a transformation far larger than one man's change of heart. Lukashenko didn't apologize in vague terms. He confessed something specific and chilling. He admitted that Kyiv knows Belarus like the back of its hand, that his country had become an open book to the Ukrainian military. And then came the detail that mattered most. He openly confirmed the existence of 500 strategic targets that Ukraine had already identified across Belarusian soil. That number is the key to everything. Cast your mind back to late May 2026. Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander, Robert Magyar Bravdy, delivered one of the bluntest military ultimatums the war had produced. At the time, Belarus, convinced Russia's nuclear and conventional shield stood behind it, brushed the warning aside. Some in Minsk even mocked it. That confidence is gone now. Because the moment the front lines shifted and Ukraine's deep strike reach climbed to a level few thought possible, that list of 500 stopped being a threat on paper and became a countdown. If Kyiv ever decided to press the button, Belarus's entire life support system, the infrastructure that keeps the state breathing, could go dark in minutes. So what's actually on that list? That's where the story stops being about a number and starts being about a country's vulnerability laid bare. The backbone of those 500 targets is almost certainly built from two things the war has taught us to watch: military air bases and the rail networks Russia leans on for logistics. The critical airfields tell the story. Machulishchi, Baranovichi, Lida, Babruisk, fields clustered near Minsk, sitting squarely inside Ukraine's priority strike envelope. But air bases are only the opening layer. Go deeper and you reach the bloodstream of any war machine, fuel and energy. The Moser refinery, strategically vital, likely sits near the very top of the list. Then add the military-industrial complexes, the ammunition production lines, the repair workshops, the radar stations, the underground command bunkers. And here's the question that should stop you. How does Ukraine know the precise coordinates of underground shelters and command echelons across an entire foreign country? The answer is an intelligence architecture built over years. Ukraine's main intelligence directorate and security service have woven a surveillance network deep inside Belarus, high-resolution military satellites, real-time feeds from Western allies, long-range reconnaissance drones mapping the blind spots of air defenses second by second, reading radar emissions to find the gaps. Major outlets like the Washington Post have pointed to these capabilities since the war's earliest days. But knowing where to strike is meaningless without the power to strike. And that's the layer that turns Lukashenko's fear into cold arithmetic. It can. And that is the part Minsk underestimated for too long. Ukraine's long-range strike system has evolved into something hybrid and extraordinarily hard to stop. Through 2025 and 2026, its unmanned forces mastered kamikaze drone swarms, low radar signature, capable of slipping past electronic warfare, reaching hundreds of kilometers. Then come the missiles. Domestically built ballistic and cruise systems now anchor the equation. The upgraded long-range Neptune, exceeding 1,000 kilometers. The Flamingo cruise missile, with a staggering 3,000-kilometer reach, enough to blanket every square inch of Belarus. Layer on the Western-supplied ATACMS and Storm Shadow, their usage restrictions largely lifted, ideally suited to hardened airfields and protected ammunition depots. Put intelligence and firepower together, and Lukashenko's apology stops looking like weakness. It starts looking like the only rational move a cornered leader could make. But fear of being struck is only half of what keeps him awake. The other half is written into the map itself. If Belarus attacked, the war wouldn't just grow, it would explode in size. A new front would open instantly. The border runs roughly 1,085 kilometers, but factor in operational depth and logistics corridors, and you're looking at a 1,500-kilometer defense zone materializing overnight. For a country Belarus's size, that isn't a front line. It's a sentence. And yet, to understand what Ukraine has already prepared for, you don't look south at Ukraine. You look north at what Russia has been building on the Belarusian frontier. Because that's where the visible story gives way to a much larger one. Radio Free Europe's Belarus service, working with independent OSINT analysts, used satellite imagery to identify at least 5 new Russian drone launch facilities near the Belarusian border. In the Bryansk, Oryol, and Smolensk regions, some only dozens of kilometers from Belarusian territory. The crown jewel sits in Oryol. The complex spans more than 5 square kilometers and doubled in size during spring 2026. Russian state channels call it the largest drone port in the world. And for once, that isn't propaganda. The OSINT data is staggering. 93 garages, 15 large hangars, capacity for over 500 drones, with at least 175 visible in shelters right now. 20 maintenance garages, 8 fixed launch ramps, a 2.5-kilometer launch road built for mass takeoffs, salvo launches from mobile platforms. And then, the detail that signals what's coming. In May 2026, new 85-meter rail launch systems appeared, purpose-built for a new generation of jet-powered drones, the Geran 5. Faster than the classic Shahed, far harder to intercept. 10 new Geran 5 ramps went up in a single month, and construction hasn't slowed. A second facility, the Shaykovka airfield in Smolensk, sits just 46 kilometers from Belarus. Construction began in January 2026. Satellite imagery shows 4 fixed ramps and 4 specialized launch vehicles, a configuration that can fire 22 Shaheds at once, hundreds in a single night. Russia even moved an air defense battery in to protect it. They know Ukraine can reach it. A third, the Tsel/Seshcha complex in the Bryansk region, 45 kilometers out, has been a Shahed hub since 2022. Confirmed by British military intelligence. Why hug the border so tightly? Because the math is operational. These drones reach Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy by flying through Belarusian airspace. And over Belarus, there is no radar warning, no interception, no shoot-down. Belarus simply lets them pass, shortening Ukraine's window to detect and destroy them. That silence is the real revelation. It isn't neutrality. It's a de facto partnership, and a partnership at this scale doesn't stay contained to one war. In 2025, 19 Russian drones crossed over Belarus and entered Polish airspace. For the first time in history, Warsaw invoked NATO's Article 4. Read that again. A launch pad sitting in Belarus didn't just threaten Ukraine, it tripped the alarm bells of the entire Western alliance. The thing we were calling a border facility had quietly become a threat to NATO's eastern flank. But the sky is only one dimension of Belarus's role. On the ground, it's performing a function that may matter even more. Since the war began, Ukraine has waged a methodical campaign against Russian oil refineries. 24 of Russia's 33 largest refineries have been struck. Some shut down entirely. Russia's oil processing capacity fell to its lowest point since 2009. The strategy is working, but success created an unexpected side effect, and Belarus rushed to fill the gap. According to Moscow Times data, in the first 5 months of 2026, gasoline exports from Belarus to Russia jumped 13-fold year over year. Diesel exports tripled. The Novopolotsk and Mozir refineries, combined annual capacity of 24 million tons, process Russian crude and ship the fuel straight into Russia's domestic market and onward to the world via Russian ports. Belarus has, in effect, become the fuel supplier for Russia's war machine. And here lies the paradox. The more successfully Ukraine strikes Russian energy infrastructure, the more critical Belarus becomes, and the more dependent Lukashenko grows on Moscow. But the darker side of that coin is unavoidable. Those two refineries feeding Russia's tanks are now legitimate Ukrainian targets. Lukashenko may believe he's standing outside the war. His refineries are producing the fuel for the tanks Russia sends to the front. Drone launch pad, fuel supplier. These are Belarus's indirect contributions, but the Kremlin's plans point towards something far more direct. On June 5th, a secret meeting convened in Brest in western Belarus. Senior officials from Minsk relayed Kremlin-directed provocative action plans against Ukraine to regional administrators and demanded total loyalty. Ukrainian intelligence knew. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Zelensky, citing intelligence, announced that Russia is preparing attack plans toward the Chernihiv-Kyiv axis from Belarusian territory or the Bryansk region. Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi confirmed the Russian General Staff is actively working through northern offensive calculations. According to RBC Ukraine sources, the Kremlin is weighing 5 scenarios. The most realistic: carving a buffer zone 10 to 20 kilometers deep in Chernihiv. The least realistic: a direct assault on Kyiv, the plan that failed in 2022. The middle options: designed to pin Ukrainian forces in the north, force withdrawals from the Donetsk front, and apply psychological pressure. Zelensky added that the Kremlin is preparing a fresh mobilization wave of 100,000 personnel, earmarked for northern operations. So is Kyiv exposed? This is where the story turns again. Ukraine is not waiting passively. In Volyn Oblast, the northwest region bordering both Belarus and Poland, sitting on the NATO resupply corridor for Western aid, anti-drone nets are going up along roads near the border. Engineering barriers are rising. Defensive positions are hardening. Surveillance is being upgraded. And the current threat level is, frankly, low. Only about 1,900 soldiers sit on the Belarusian side. Russia simply doesn't have the force concentration for a major operation there. You cannot move tens of thousands of troops into Belarus in secret. The border is fortified and mined. Ukrainian drones would grind any advance down to an agonizing crawl. Infantry and tanks toward Kyiv didn't work in 2022. There is no reason it works the second time. But Putin's real calculation may be subtler. The threat itself forces Ukraine to hold forces in the north. Every brigade tied down near Belarus is a brigade missing from the south. He isn't necessarily planning to invade. He's planning to make Ukraine think he might, and pay for the doubt. The difference is that the leverage in Ukraine's hands today is incomparably stronger than it was 3 years ago. And that shift has rewritten the rules on 2 fronts at once. Start with the military. Magyar confirmed the first 500 high-value targets in Belarus have been pre-programmed: bases, command centers, logistics nodes. This is no longer rhetoric. With the Flamingo's 3,000-kilometer reach, all of Belarus is covered. Novopolotsk and Mozyr, the refineries propping up Russia's fuel supply, are squarely in the crosshairs. And what can the Belarusian army field against this? A small force, aging equipment, units with no combat experience. By Carnegie's assessment, Ukraine has become incomparably the stronger party. Without outside help, Lukashenko cannot even threaten a counter. Then there's the diplomatic front, which military superiority has quietly transformed. Over the past 6 months, Zelensky has hardened sharply toward Minsk. 2 new sanctions packages against Lukashenko's circle. He met Belarusian opposition leader Svietlana Tsikhanouskaya in Vilnius, then received her in Kyiv. The message could not be clearer. Ukraine no longer recognizes Lukashenko's legitimacy and now treats the opposition as its counterpart. Zelensky went further, stating openly that Ukraine is prepared to take preventive measures and that it has the capability to conduct preventive work. At Zelensky's request, French President Macron called Lukashenko for the first time in over 4 years to spell out the consequences of deeper involvement. That call marks a paradigm shift. Before 2022, Europe saw Belarus as a neutral buffer. Now it's seen as Russia's military extension. As Carnegie puts it, keeping Minsk on edge no longer carries real risk for Kyiv. There's no incentive to soften. 3 years ago, Lukashenko stood over Zelensky. Today, he's the one seeking to lower the temperature, offering talks. That reversal is the clearest proof that Ukrainian deterrence is working. But deterrence explains only one side of the man. To understand the apology fully, you have to see the trap he's standing in. Even as Ukraine grows stronger, Lukashenko cannot say no to Putin. He is caught between two forces, and both are squeezing. His dependence on Moscow isn't abstract. It's concrete and personal. When hundreds of thousands of Belarusians flooded the streets during the 2020 election crisis, what saved him was Putin. Security guarantees, intelligence, a diplomatic shield. Since that day, opposition leaders have been jailed or exiled, independent media shut down, and his power welded entirely to Moscow's guarantee. The economic chains are just as tight. EU and US sanctions gutted Belarus's export revenue. Potash was cut from European markets, airspace restricted, financial channels narrowed. Minsk leaned harder on Moscow, and Putin uses that dependence with full awareness. Yet Putin can't simply drag him into the war because the entry cost would shatter the regime. The most critical loss would be the Washington table, the dialogue with the US that opened in recent months, sanctions relief for prisoner swaps, talk of a possible Lukashenko visit to America, Washington pressing Poland and Lithuania on potash transit. That channel is Lukashenko's only alternative lifeline to Moscow. Entering the war would sever it instantly. EU sanctions would harden, and the economy would become 100% dependent on a Russia that, bleeding from its own war economy, can barely afford to subsidize anyone. And then the Ukrainian leverage activates. Refineries, bases, infrastructure, all targets. Worst of all is the home front. Casualties, economic collapse, a fresh wave of fury. No one knows better than Lukashenko how fragile the foundation 2020 left behind. This is why his messaging contradicts itself. At Grodno, in a single speech, he said, "We don't want to fight in Ukraine." And minutes later, "We are ready to defend Russia." He offered Zelensky talks, then the same week ran joint nuclear drills with Russia and kept hosting the Oreshnik missile system on his soil. That isn't confusion. It's the language of a man trying to signal both sides at once because he cannot afford to lose either. So return to where we began, a man apologizing. It was never about regret. It was a status report. Lukashenko's apology to Zelensky was the public confirmation of a transformation that had already happened beneath the surface, the moment a regional strongman became a hostage of geography, dependency, and a target list 500 names long. The visible story was a change of tone. The real story is a change of era. The point where being Russia's launchpad and Russia's gas station stopped being a source of leverage and became a liability that could be erased in minutes. And that leaves the questions that will define what comes next. If Ukraine's deterrence keeps tightening, does Lukashenko's balancing act survive, or does one of the two forces squeezing him finally win? If Putin needs the northern threat more than the northern invasion, how long can a bluff hold once everyone has read the cards? And the largest question of all, when a country's silence becomes a weapon, and that weapon turns into a target, has the balance of this entire war already shifted north, while everyone was still watching the south? We'll keep following these developments. Subscribe to the Worldline Network, and if you'd like the analysis to continue even after you step away from the screen, you'll find us on Spotify, ready to turn long drives and heavy traffic into something worth the wait. Thank you for watching.